All right. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. Hopefully everyone had a good one. Okay, so I think the only thing to really do is turn it back over to PG&E, and we'll continue with the slide presentation, and we'll go from there. Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. Bring up the presentation here. Okay, so this is Luke Nickerman. I will be covering the forecast and need determination. So we can go ahead and jump on in. Can someone just confirm that they can hear me?
Can hear you, Luke.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Okay, so we're going to do just a quick overview of the forecast. I will say, we might not have all of the details correct, and so to the extent there are CEC staff on the line, if they do see anything that we've mischaracterized, if you don't mind pointing that out either in the chat or in the Q&A, it would be much appreciated. Okay, so the IPER forecast, it's produced in odd years with minor updates performed in even years. In an IPER year, preliminary forecast is released in the spring, and there's kind of a process that then they go through to reconcile differences with utility forecasts, socialize the forecast, etc. And then a final is adopted in the winter. It's used across a number of proceedings, including the IRP, RA, transmission planning, RPS, energy efficiency planning, and I'm sure there's others that I've left out. There are low, mid, and high scenarios, and those are for a number of the inputs. So it's not just the base forecast where you have low, mid, and high scenarios, but also with things like distributed energy resources, for instance, where you also have low, mid, and high scenarios. Those are all based on a 1 and 2. And then there is an hourly forecast that's produced for the mid case, currently produced for the mid case. And then that is also based on 1 and 2 forecast. And that's the forecast that we've used a lot in some of the analysis that you've seen in some of the workshops. So what are some slice of day considerations? So forecast changes, we'll start with those. So our understanding is that shifting to something more conservative, so for instance, if the commission wanted to go from 1 and 2 to 1 and 5 or 1 and 10, that's possible without a lot of additional excessive administrative burden at the CEC. However, such a move would need to be coordinated across a number of proceedings, right? And so we just talked about how many proceedings in which the forecast is used. And so it wouldn't make sense for us to just shift in the RA proceeding. It would need to be kind of replicated across a number of proceedings, including the IRP, for instance. And then any change to the forecast can impact the required PRM. And so, in our thinking, it might make sense to kind of decide on the appropriate forecast level after doing some loss of load analysis. Okay, and then what are some changes that we've seen that could be needed for slice of day? And the most obvious one is that the existing approach is it aligns with the coincident gross peak, right? And that's kind of the focus in terms of setting requirements and aligning up the forecasts. But under a slice of day, you would need to do a similar process across each of the slices. And if you're looking at like a 24 slice approach, you would need to do it for every hour. And then on need determination, there's a couple of things that we that we had proposed in previous workshops. that we want to reiterate here. And so the first one is that in workshop 2, we had proposed using the maximum hourly values in a month or a season from the hourly level load forecast, and then using that as the basis to establish requirements in the future framework. In our view, this is similar to how the requirements are currently established, but just at a more granular level. And then it avoids potential issues in the future when the grid is evolved and more times of the day could be at risk of insufficient capacity. And then the second one is we had also used the highest value in each season and slice to set the requirements for that season and slice. There's alternatives, so instead of using the highest value, you could use like an average value. But the risk if you do something like that is that in the hours that are higher, you could potentially have reliability problems, and so that's why we had kind of focused on that highest value approach. And so just an example there, if you can think 4-hour slice, some of those hours in that 4-hour slice, the load is going to be higher, some will be lower. You would essentially be setting the requirement at that highest hour. One other thing to mention here is that if you did a 24 slice approach, then you wouldn't need to do this, right? Because you would be essentially setting the requirement for every hour, and that hour would coincide with the load in that hour. Okay, and so that kind of wraps up our section on the forecasted need determination. It's a relatively short section. Do we want to take questions now and before we go on to the PRM? Okay. Well, if there aren't questions, then yeah, we could go on to the PRM and take any questions on the section at the end as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Krista. Krista's on the RA reform team at PG&E. Krista, do you want to take it away?
All right, thanks, Luke. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so we can dive into some PRM overview. So we can go to the next slide. So we're just starting here with some of the history of the PRM, how we got here. So the planning reserve margin, the PRM, was introduced in 2006 as a tool to ensure reliability. It was originally set at 15%. This was in response to some reliability studies showing that it provided an LOLE of 1 day in 50 years. So what are the components of the PRM? So this original 15% had a 6% operating reserve. This is required by NERC, a 7.5% outage rate, and then 1.5% demand variability. So recent changes to the PRM, summer reliability OIR raised the PRM to the implied PRM to 17.5%, and then recently in the CEC summer stack analysis, they used a 22.5% PRM there. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so here we have just an example of how we may want to update the PRM, change the components, and then some potential additions or subtractions from the components. So what we have here is just examples of sort of ranges that we've seen for each component. So we've kept the 6% operating reserve constant as that's a requirement. The outage rate, it's gone anywhere between 5 and 9%. We may be able to remove the outage rate if UCAP is adopted, but if UCAP is not adopted, this 5 to 9%. And then the demand variability component has ranged anywhere from 1.5 to 9% for demand variability. And then a potential additional component would be resource variability. So this would be separate from sort of a forced outage rate. So really meant to capture the uncertainty and variability in production from, fuel limited resources, so solar and wind, et cetera. So when you look at all of the ranges here of the potentials for the PRM, this could range anywhere from 7.5% if we're removing the forced outage rate, up to 24% or above, depending on the addition of this resource variability piece. So we talked a little bit about the benefits of using the PRM to address uncertainty. So rather than changing sort of the core framework and changing components that impact the regulatory and commercial frameworks, the PRM can be sort of an easy lever to reflect changing conditions. We've seen the CPUC sort of rely on the PRM to reflect the summer reliability and other issues. And then the addition of a resource uncertainty component could better reflect the current status of the supply portfolio as we see greater penetration of renewables. And then sort of an open question that we have, and I'm sure a lot of people have, is should the PRM vary by season or slice? I think our current thinking is that we lean towards not varying the PRM, but open to thinking on this. That's all I have. So I think, Luke, I can pass it back to you.
And Luke, would this be a good time to take some questions, or what do you want, another passing point a bit later on?
Yeah, I think we could do some questions here. So the next section is allocation.
Okay.
So why don't we go ahead and we can pause here and take some questions. I see the number of hands that have gone up.
Okay, so let's take some questions on basically forecasts and PRM. Let's do Noaa, Brett, Chris, Devin first, and then we'll keep going.
Hey, this is Noah. I'm from Middle River Power. Can you all hear me? Great.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks. Question. So is this a sort of a proposal on a bottom-up approach to establish the PRM, or were you thinking mainly as these are inputs into an LOLE study to calculate the PRM?
Can you expand a little bit? What do you mean by the bottoms up?
Well, it seems like or at least the way I'm reading this seems to suggest that these are components of the planning reserve margin, and so sort of when you add them together, you can get somewhere between 7.5% to 24%. But whereas if you take or put these as inputs into an LOLE study to calculate what is the expected need for capacity to reach 0.1 LOLE, you may get a much different result, right, as a combination of these inputs that does not yield a 24% PRM. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, I think I know what you're getting at, and others from PG&E feel free to jump in. I think our thinking was that some of these you would determine kind of in advance. So, for instance, if you were adopting some kind of a UCAP, then you would want to adjust the outage rate. And there was comments earlier about studying the outage rate as well, given that it hasn't been studied in a while, and potentially updating that even if UCAP isn't adopted. And so, for some of these, I think outage rates stand out in particular. For some of these, you would want to try to, in advance, get a better estimate of what you think it should be. And I think you could do something similar for resource variability, right? Depending on what the final framework is for renewables, for instance.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, Noah, is some of this stuff is going to be fixed. I mean, it's like the operating reserves, ancillary services. We know how much the ISO needs to have committed on top of what the load forecast is to be able to operate the market. And that, for the most part, would be something that would be fairly well fixed at a level sort of on an ex-ante basis in terms of what are the amount of reserves that are needed on an operating basis. Some of the rest of the other components of these, there's some question as to, first of all, whether they should be included or whether they're being taken up by another portion of the framework. such as the forced outage rates going into the UCAP, and whether or not we're using a UCAP or we're explicitly adding the forced outage rates to the planning reserve margin. I mean, that's one question that would have to be determined and discussed. Also, we would also probably want to think also about how the demand variability should be accounted for. In particular, we're moving to a period where there's going to be more climate-induced weather changes, and that's going to introduce some uncertainty. Do we want to put something in the planning reserve margin for that? That is also somewhat of an empirical question, or it might be informed by some other type of analysis. But generally, what we're saying to some degree is that once you, and again, resource variability. Currently, resource variability is not really adopted in the planning reserve margin, other than through sort of what the outage rates are. But we have a lot more resources now for which there is variability in the output that's not covered anywhere else in the planning reserve margin. And so the question to some degree is, do we want to explicitly introduce something into the planning reserve margin that would look at that? Now, that to some degree would be looking at sort of and go hand in hand to a large degree with sort of what is the counting methodology that's being used for some of those uncertain resources, namely the wind and the solar. What level of exceedance are you using there? And do you want to try and cover some of that uncertainty that you may be introducing by essentially setting a particular level of exceedance by having something explicitly in the planning reserve margin to be able to cover that. Now, those types of things, generally you would want to make, and I guess what our proposal would be, is that generally you want to sort of make sure you identify those things in advance that you think need to be relatively solid and wouldn't be changing. And then you need to be looking to some degree at what some of the interdependencies are with the way the rest of the framework is structured. And you would want to be thinking about, if I nail down counting rules, if I nail down whether we're going to use the UCAP or not, okay, let's then look at what we've got and how that sets up with the loss of load expectation, and assuming a particular level of the PRM. If the LOLE is higher than what the target is, in terms of, that then, or lower for that matter, you could then adjust the planning reserve margin to be able to nail it to those values. So I don't know, Noah, is that helpful in explaining the way we're thinking about it?
Not sure. I'm not sure we're bridging the gap here, but I won't take too long. I guess my next question is, do you expect sort of a 1% change on outage rate to impact the LOLE or the effective PRM on a 1% basis as well? Are they equal?
That's an empirical question, and okay. And without knowing sort of what the setup of them and the assumptions are going into the model, that's not something I can answer on an ex ante basis.
Okay, thanks.
So I think I'm next. This is Brent Buffet from SCE. I maybe proposed, or what I'm hearing is that it's, this is the thought process of kind of what's in PRM now and kind of how it might shake out in the future. But the PG&E's proposal is actually to set a reliability planning standard, 1 in 10, 1 in 20, something like that, do an LOLE and actually determine PRM based on an LOLE. So, Peter, that's what I think I heard in your response to
no, Brett, I think that's sort of what our general thinking is. I think we're open as to whether or not that is a sound way of doing it or not doing it, but that's sort of what our current thinking is.
I just want to point out, so that's what SE supports, that's consistent with what we've said in IRP space, and at least I think that should be done in IRP space, is both a relook at the reliability planning standard, and the appropriate PRM to get there, and then apply it in both areas, the IRP and RA. Anyway, but I'll
thanks, Brett.
Hey, Peter, this is Chris Devin, Customized Energy Solutions. I had some similar thoughts to Noah and Brent, actually, just trying to understand exactly what PG&E was proposing. So that last answer actually helped me out a lot. And I think that is a good suggestion. And I would just point out that other regions all use that type of an approach in other RTOs for their, setting their PRMs. They generally, use these type of deterministic items here as inputs into that stochastic, analysis. And so I think we've been living under a deterministic 15% PRM for much too long, and I think it's very appropriate to do that. So I just want to throw in strong support for this kind of an approach. If it is going to be looking at the, those updates, we should be modeling that and updating those regularly. And I think, I wouldn't argue with Brent's point about maybe doing an IRP, but I think there should be some consistency there. And I think it just needs to be updated and ensured that we are meeting that kind of a generation adequacy target of like a 1 in 10 or whatever we ultimately feel is appropriate. But I certainly think it shouldn't be less than 1 in 10. And I'll end with that. Thanks.
Yeah, Chris, I guess our thinking to some degree is that it might be something that the commission wants to do on a regular basis. Whether it doesn't necessarily have to be annually, but it might be something that the commission should be looking at regularly, rather than letting too much time go by about adjusting sort of where the procurement needs to be and what the levels need to be to get to the level of reliability.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Peter. I would just say that, other regions generally do it annually, but if it's maybe biannually or something along those lines, I wouldn't be too concerned with it. But certainly I think anything more than a few years of a static level would probably be problematic in my mind. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, let's move on to Doug Karpa, then Christian Lambert, and then Darius.
Yeah, hi, Doug Karpa, Peninsula Clean Energy. Yeah, well, it's very helpful getting all that clarification of using the LOLE study to set planning reserve margins. Clearly that's the right way to do it. And I do think that makes a case for doing it in IRP, since that is on a 2-year cycle anyway, and doing a lot of similar things. And I guess it's worth reiterating the obvious point. I think, Peter, you already mentioned this, that the planning reserve margin that will come out of that is going to depend pretty critically on what the exceedance values selected are. So if we pick a 50% level, then probably that's so conservative that the PRMs would be lower. If we pick 75%, that is less conservative, in which case the PRMs would go up. And it's a little bit, I think, going to land in the same place in terms of the total amount of resource we end up having to procure either way, because of the way those two numbers would work. And I think the other aspect about the IRP that's going to be pretty useful is that I suspect the PRM that would result in a given fixed level loss of load expectation is going to depend an awful lot on what the resource mix is. And so seems again like a pretty obvious point, but that again I think would suggest that lodging that within the IRP space, where those considerations of what the generation mix are expressly being done, that would make a whole lot of sense as well. So I think we may have shocking agreement on this point.
Thanks, Doug.
Christian?
Hi, I'm sorry, it took a second to unmute. This is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocate, and I'd like to just offer a comment, I think on slide 15, where there's a bullet that says it would be prudent to connect the LLE study into, what does it say? It may be prudent to decide on the forecast after doing loss of load analysis. I think just one point I would make here is that one issue that's emerging is that the tools we have, the production cost modeling for that loss of load analysis, in being tied to normalized weather years that are based on decades, 30 years of actual weather data, one thing we tend to see from the modeling is an underestimation of climate trends. And if you were to say weight more recent years more heavily or look more granularly in other ways at those trends, you do pick up accelerating trends in, say, cooling degree days that aren't necessarily reflected if you are just taking those 30 years of normalized weather data and using that for the draws in the LLE analysis. The result of this is that when we're talking about the PRM, there is sort of an element that we need to consider, which is what is that missing piece of climate impact? In the IRP, I think it's actually Energy Division staff who've originated a number, at least to anchor the conversation. If you look at the midterm reliability ruling from February 22nd in the IRP, or the preferred system plan ruling from August, I think 17th of this year, those two rulings do get into like a little detail, not too much, about a 1.8% potential climate adder, and this is framed within the context of what staff were calling the high need scenario when this was first presented in the midterm reliability analysis. We've been following the Energy Commission's IPA working group on demand, and that 1.8% looks, I think, somewhat reasonable at this time for the whole CAISO footprint. But if we were to disaggregate that by TAC area, it might actually be a little bit different across the three. So that's just some feedback I have on this point, which is that if we are going to be moving forward driven by the LLE, it may miss this impact, and it is actually quite significant in terms of what the final PRM would be. And then finally, I just want to highlight there was some chatter in the chat about how the current PRM does or does not relate to the 0.1 LOE target. And I think this is a big part of that story. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. I mean, you make a really good point, which is that we need to really pay attention to what's being assumed about the inputs into the LOLE analysis and the particularly when it's going to be setting the PRM. And because you're right in that we know that the climate is changing, the question to some degree is how do we take that into account when we are doing this analysis? And because you're right, it's not going to be showing up only in the historic look back, and we'll have to be doing something to be able to adjust for it. So that is really a good point, and that's something that should not be lost on people. Is that the sophistication of these analyses and how accurate they're going to be really is going to be dependent upon sort of how well the assumptions are going to be met on a going forward basis. So thank you for that observation, Christian.
Hi, Peter. Darius with California Wind Energy Association. I just want to remind us that on the point where PRM should be the same for all slices of the day, I want to remind you of a study that Don Brooks and CPUC did a couple of years ago, a very careful analysis of whether PRM should, based on expected unserved energy, LOLE, they did it a couple of years ago, and in that they found out that to meet the 1 in 10 LOLE consistently, you needed to have a PRM of around 15%. I think it was 15 to 20% for summer month, and around 30% or more in winter month. And of course, the reasoning at the time made a lot of sense. I don't recall exactly how we went through that, but maybe it doesn't matter. PRM doesn't matter as much for non-critical times of the year, but at least in order to meet the 1 in 10, if you want to mathematically meet the 1 in 10 or whatever LOLE standard we pick, it appeared that it was critical to have much higher PRM during non-critical periods than during the critical periods, and that was an interesting observation. And I remember the reason actually was it for it as they were spreading the 1 in 10, in other words, 2.4 hours of outage in a year. If you spread it to every month or every slice equally, you need a ton more PRM during the critical slice of day, as opposed to if you allow the outages to happen to happen during well, it's supposed to be happening where you have capacity shortage, and that's how they ended up with a much lower PRM for the critical month. In that case, critical month. In this case, critical slice, and then the other non-critical month. In this case, non-critical slice. Something that I just a reminder so that we don't summarily dismiss the point about non-equal PRM.
Yeah, Darius, I guess from our perspective, you're right in that from a reliability standpoint, it may make sense to basically have a varying PRM, just because you want to make sure that you're covering the right amount and not too much. But on the other hand, from a compliance and simplicity matter, the question is you may not, because it may be much more expensive to administer a PRM that varies by month or by slice or whatever. And so that's the reason why we pretty much ask it as a question and not sort of as a conclusion. And generally our thinking for the most part is we think it might be better just to keep it the same because of the convenience of the framework and the regulatory aspects and the transactability aspects, even though there might be a justification for not having it to be the same at all times. So it's really an open question from our perspective.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to Bridget Sparks and then Lynn Marshall.
Thanks. So a couple of thoughts. One are kind of building off this idea of a variable PRM. I think we should, kind of as Peter, you said, you pose it as a question, and I think we should, forestall an answer because, some of the outage data that I've looked at so far, there is a pattern between peak and off-peak months. And so there might be, justifications for slightly higher or lower, depending on how outages are accounted for. You might want to vary it there. I don't think the CAISO would support varying the PRM on a slice basis, but there might be justification across months or seasons that might, kind of balance the reliability and the transactability issue that you brought up. On a kind of another point, I know a lot of folks have talked about planned outages and, is there a way for the RA program to help ease some of the burden that generators are having with the new ISO rule that any planned outage has to have substitute capacity up front? And so one of the reasons we had to do that is because with the monthly construct, there really wasn't as much headroom month over month that you could really kind of continue this practice of waiting last minute to see, do you have enough excess capacity to allow the planned outage? And so one thing that maybe for folks to consider is, for like an off-peak season, would we consider adding a planned outage reserve margin where the CAISO, you kind of build in this excess headroom in the RA construct where, we know RA is a little cheaper in the off-peak months, and that's when most of the generators want to do their planned maintenance. So do we sort of socialize the cost of that maintenance across the system and, buy some excess, everybody's a little excess, and then the CAISO could sort of relax its rules around having to have that substitute capacity up front because, the PRM already accounts for it, and then we would just be doing, studies to make sure that, you're only matching whatever, planned outage you assumed for that period, especially if we maintain the monthly construct. So just kind of wanted to throw that out there as, maybe something for folks to consider is the PRM also maybe a place for us to address planned outages depending on, how other elements get designed. So that's just, one thought I had that we haven't necessarily considered.
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. I tend to agree. There is a lot things that we need to consider how we play with how we establish these levels and what they're intended to do. And I think we need to be just very explicit about what our thinking is and what our assumptions are about how we're setting these requirements and on what basis and why we're varying them if we vary them. But again, we're really just wanted to tee up the discussion to basically say, hey, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be constant. It might be for some particular reasons, but it is an open question from our perspective at this point.
Let's move on to Lynn Marshall and then Kathleen Colbert, please.
Hi, Lynn Marshall, CEC. Climate change impacts have come up a few times today. So we do have in the IPR some limited climate change effects, but more important, we have a project underway, EPIC funded with scripts to develop downscale climate projections for California, and we'll use that to better characterize temperature variability in our forecast. So that won't show up in this year's forecast, but in the next year, 2 years, we'll have improved climate change modeling in the IPR demand forecast.
Thanks, Lynn. It's glad to hear that the CEC is making that effort into trying to bake it into sort of what those climate change impacts could be, and not just relying on historic. And I think for some degree, again, that needs to be taken into account. If we think it's baked into the load forecast, then we may need to adjust how we think about that and how we try and account for that when we're looking at something like the PRM.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I heard my name next, so I'll just take it away. I wanted to say thank you to Bridget for bringing up that issue. I did want to remind the broader community, and we'll do a reminder at the next workshop, that including substitution risk in the PRM explicitly to address that issue is in Vistra's proposal that we presented back in October 6th. As far as I'm aware, we're retaining that. I haven't heard any pushback on it. And now that I've heard that CAISO conceptually supports that idea, we're definitely keeping it in our proposal. And we'll go over that again next workshop. But yes, it includes, as a part of the uncertainty factors, that we need to be differentiating the uncertainty associated with risks of forced outages versus uncertainty associated with planned outages without substitution. We think it can be done similarly, but they are slightly different types of outages. And so I believe the tracking exists to be able to track those and kind of calculate a variable outage rate by the different periods, but we'll delve into that further, and happy for CAISO to collaborate with us on that. Very interesting.
Okay, with that, I think we covered everyone. Christian, did you raise your hand again, or did it stay up?
Yeah, this is Christian Lambert. I did want to bring up a second point, responding to some comments folks are making about the relationship between the IRP and RA PRMs. And I think one point for folks to consider, if we tie these two different PRMs together too closely, what we might end up with on our hands is an unfortunate recipe for perpetually tight RA market conditions and high prices for ratepayers, because the IRP, we have a baseline of resources, and we do the capacity expansion work to fill up the portfolio to the desired level, whatever that may be. And then if we have the same PRM doing behind that work and behind the RA requirements in the RA program, we're going to cause LSEs to need to contract with every single one of those assumed resources in the IRP. And someone today already made the point, you're just giving enormous market power to whatever that last unit is going to be. And really, in this case, all units are going to have that residual demand effect. So we've been advocating, and I think we did put most of our written comments in the IRP, so I'll just sort of summarize here that it's worthwhile thinking about these two different programs, RA and IRP, potentially having different PRMs, with the IRP having a slightly higher PRM for just planning purposes, such that we end up harnessing these very large projected build-outs of new resources to refresh the overall fleet. And yes, that would require the commission to undertake some sort of proactive planning for a carrying capacity in terms of retirement of existing baseline resources, potentially above what's already baked into the baseline. We do think that might be rather modest in terms of the actual year-to-year changes in capacity, but nonetheless, it's not currently reflected in either program.
Christian, thanks for that observation and the relationship between the two. I think certainly in the chat there's been some back and forth about whether the PRMs need to be exactly the same between the IRP and the RA, and I don't know that that's what PG&E was endorsing. I think there needs to be at least some account taken into account to some degree, sort of what some of the other parameters are that are being used to set the requirements.
I see another raised hand from Noah.
Hey, this is Noah from Middle River Power. Hey, I was gonna respond to Christian. I wanted to follow up with him. Christian, are you suggesting that in IRP space, that there essentially would end up being a more stringent LOLE relative to RA space, if all other things are held equal in a sense of capacity counting for resources?
Actually, I would return to the point I was trying to make earlier this morning. Was actually I have the opposite concern, which is that we end up with NQCs coming out of RA reform that collectively produce a portfolio of resources that is over reliable relative to whatever LOLE standard we want to see decided upon in the IRP, because we don't yet have any visibility into how portfolio level effects might be allocated back into those NQCs for LLCs to plan around.
That's weird. I would have thought that at least in RA space, when we all calculate a 0.1 LOLE with a specific set of counting conventions, that it would result in a particular planning reserve margin, which may be different than IRP space, even to achieve the same LOLE. But
I think I was responding to PG&E's proposal to start with the IRP and have the IRP do an LOLE study to the 0.1 or to whatever other different target might be selected, and then have that feedback into RA. And we're sort of observing that really, I think the process gets driven by what LLCs put into their individual IRPs, and that in turn has to incorporate whatever comes out of RA. What we haven't seen from our perspective in this reform process so far is explicit allocation of benefits that could accrue at the collective portfolio level, but not at the individual LLC planning level.
But isn't that primarily due to the fact that we're talking about two different terms, mainly that our RA is sort of more short term, 1 year at a time, versus IRP being much longer, 10 years or longer, right? And so we're not looking at the same time frame.
Except that those IRP resources do have RA attributes. So when the IRP orders procurement and we do get those contracts with those lengths, it sort of crowds out or has the potential to crowd out some of the baseline resources whose contracts may be rolling off. And it's unclear to us at Cal Advocates what mechanism the commission has, if any, in effect right now to look at an adopted reference system portfolio or preferred system portfolio and enforce that to any significant degree without causing market power impacts that would be detrimental to ratepayers.
Okay, I appreciate that color. Yeah, I think some of that multi-year requirement stuff is later on in the next or the set of workshops. Maybe that has something to do with it as well. Thanks.
Doug Carpet.
Yeah, I'm just mulling over that conversation. Yeah, I definitely, I think there's we might consider having the same planning reserve margin, but having an express, like, additional market liquidity adder, to that margin in IRP to avoid the market power issues. I can imagine that there's a, if you hit the planning reserve margin exactly on the nose, then you kind of have infinite market power, and like basically whatever the penalty price is, that's what's going to get charged, right? Because LSEs have to pay the penalty, or they have to pay that amount to the generator. As you increase above that on the nose procurement, there's less and less market power, so you get RA savings, but then you also have to pay for the additional procurement. And at some point those lines cross. There's probably some optimal margin above the PRM that, like, IRP should be incorporating for that would account for, like, unforeseen things, and also to make sure the RA market stays liquid, which would be, I think, not necessarily something that we would do. And I mean, maybe that's something that we would recommend to the IRP proceeding that they consider, but not necessarily something we would adopt here, because we're thinking about both reliability and cost. And that's that cost part where we have to think about how well the market's going to function as well. Good issues to think about. I'll be thinking about it as we go.
Okay, with that, I think we can keep moving along the PG&E team.
Okay, this is Luke again. So we're going to move to allocation. Okay, so we'll cover kind of the current approach, and then we'll look at what are some of the changes that slice of day raises. So the system load is based on the CEC forecast, and that's used to determine the overall system gross peak requirement. And I should say, this is our understanding. To the extent that Lynn or anyone else from the CEC sees any mischaracterizations, please speak up and let us know. And so once that overall system level forecast has been requirement has been established, the CEC receives and aggregates hourly LSE forecasts, and then the CEC kind of reconciles coincident peak differences between the hyper system peak and then the aggregate LSE forecasts. To the extent that there are differences once you aggregate the individual LSE ones. And then the requirements are allocated to the LSEs based on each LSE's peak load ratio share. An important piece of this is that there's no current consideration of unique LSE load shapes for non-peak hours. So what are some of the changes that we need under a slice of day framework? So the first one is the slice of day introduces a need to perform a similar process in each season and slice, right? And so you can imagine that could be quite a few additional hours, particularly under like a 24 slice monthly framework. And so the CEC would need to replicate that current process for the coincident peak for these other hours. And I should mention that this is on a gross basis. We'll kind of address a net basis in a minute. So it's more burdensome than the current approach, but it would kind of follow the same existing process. And so to the extent that there's a process in place to do this without too much administrative burden, it obviously will be more work, but it hopefully would not imply a lot of additional administrative effort. And so here's an illustrative example. So in this example, we have kind of the overall system load, the blue line there. We've kind of created a very simplified system where we have two LSEs, both of which make up 50% of the market in terms of the total energy, but they have different load shapes. And so in this kind of modified version, you would be doing kind of allocating requirements by slice. And so, if you look at slice 1, for instance, you would have LSE 1, which is in the green. Their requirement would be basically set at where that purple line is. And then you have LSE 2, which would be set at where that red line is, right? So it's in that particular slice, it's the LSE 2 has a requirement that's less than what the LSE 1 does. But if you go to slice 5, those requirements are flipped, right? And with the nature of LSE 2's load, which is peakier in the evening hours, in slice 5, they would have the higher requirement in that particular slice, right? As you can see with the red line. And so this would be kind of a process that's replicated across, the number of slices that kind of end up being adopted. And this particular example uses 6 slices, but if you do a 24 slice approach, that would be replicated across all 24 hours. Okay, we've also talked about a net load framework. Peter kind of walked through the recap slide of that earlier in the presentation. And so how, if a net load framework were adopted, how would that change things? And so in that approach, we see a parallel accounting process being needed for wind and solar resources. And so you would kind of go through the same load forecasting process, but at the same time, you would be following a similar process for wind and solar. So at kind of the highest level, you would aggregate all the wind and solar resources to develop kind of that top line net load curve at the system level. And then the wind and solar resources would be netted off the gross load for each of the relevant LSEs that have the wind and solar resources in their portfolio. And that would then form a net load curve for that particular LSE. Another point here is that we believe this could be done at different levels of aggregation for wind and solar. So we've talked about different levels before. You could go down to the individual resource level. You could have some kind of aggregated technology level, and then also some kind of aggregated like geographic level, for instance, for wind. And then the other important consideration that we've identified is that the net load approach would require earlier showings of the renewable resources by LSEs, so that like net load process could be done in advance of setting the LSE RA requirements. And a kind of parallel piece to this is because your wind and solar kind of goes into the load forecasting process, we would need to think about how does that impact like the tradability of those resources, because if LSEs were trading those resources in the midst of a compliance cycle, it would create issues with kind of the load forecast side as opposed to the supply side. So that's our last slide. So we'll go ahead and stop there and see if there's any questions.
No questions so far. I think you can move along.
Okay. Well, so that is the last slide in our presentation. So,
excuse me, this is Sumera. I raised my hand. Maybe you couldn't see it, but.
Oh, go ahead, Sue.
I had, it seems to me you're kind of glossing over the process the CEC undertakes in, which factors into the RA requirements. And when you, first of all, each load serving entity provides their hourly low historical loads to the Energy Commission, and they provide a forecast. And the Energy Commission takes each LSCs and does both a coincident adjustment as well as, let's do the first, they do the check for the plausibility. So first they have to iron out differences in plausibility to make sure that they have an accurate forecast from the LSC. And then they do a coincident adjustment, and that is to ensure LSCs with quite different load shapes do not get burdened with an overly large amount of RA requirements. So that's something that's been in place for a number of years now. And I'm assuming that any process we come up with, or any slice approach we come up with, will still this Energy Commission will still be doing the same kind of analysis on every LSC's submittal. Well, first, let me ask that question. Is that something that you've thought about and agree with?
Yeah, we've thought about it, and I think we agree with your kind of perspective. But at the same time, I think it's it'd be good to hear from the CEC on kind of the feasibility of that. Ideally, I think that would be the approach. So yeah, I agree.
And on your slide 23, you have two LSCs with different load shapes. So I assume they say the LSC 1, the green one, is a flatter load shape, and a load serving entity 2 is a more traditional load shape, closer to the system load shape. So is this, I guess, the CEC working in conjunction with the PUC would be assessing this for every LSC and whatever slices we end up with? Is that how you think it would work?
Yeah, that's the way we've kind of laid it out here, but we're open to other thoughts on that as well.
Okay, I'm a little bit confused by using the terminology modified top down, unless it's all, specify what you mean by that. But my thought is that we're keeping the same process. The Energy Commission is maybe having to do more analysis because there's more hours involved, but it's the same process. They look at each LSC's data, they do a coincident adjustment, they do a plausibility adjustment, and from there, that's used as the basis for setting the RA allocations for each LSC. So I'm assuming that is going to continue to be the same process. And I see Lynn Marshall raised her hand, so it'd be good to hear from her.
Yeah, let's go first with Lynn, and then Eric and Brian.
Okay, so yes, I can confirm. I'm thinking about it the same way. It's LSC specific coincidence adjustments, and just if it's a 24-hour slice, then we've got to do that for all 24 hours. In fact, under any slices, you really need all the hours if you're going to have an energy sufficiency check. So yeah, it's definitely more complex work for us, but overall the same process and approach.
Thanks, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks for confirming that. And just in terms of the terminology, we are calling it modified top-down, but really that modification is just allocating it out to additional hours. So Sue, you were right on that.
Yeah, I think of what we have now as kind of a hybrid of top-down, bottoms-up, because we have the IPER as the top control total, and then but we do allow LSCs to submit their individual forecasts, and then there's a reconciliation process.
Eric?
Sorry, Eric Wilcow, CCA. I think that you just answered it. So effectively what we're doing here is it's individual load curves, and it's really individual LSC renewable resources netting off of that. So it's not really a top-down almost in any way. Is that what I'm understanding?
So that would be for the net load approach, where you're actually netting off the renewables. We started here with kind of a gross perspective, right? So in this case, renewables would not be netted off.
Okay.
Still be accounted for on the supply side.
Okay, so if you did it from a net standpoint, is there a reason why you would net those off of the total rather than off of the individual LSE?
Well, you would do both, right? Because you would need them to line up both at the kind of the top line level and for each individual LSE, right?
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hi, this is Brian Beering for American Clean Power. We've expressed concerns in the past about the idea of shifting from an ELCC methodology to a netting approach, largely because, harkening back to my earlier comment, it could be disruptive of the contracting that's happening right now. So I think we still have those concerns, even if it is more of a bottoms-up approach, as Eric was commenting. I guess I had one specific question about how it would work if you're, say, contracting a resource that has, say it's a wind resource, and that load serving entity's already adjusted net load curve has already been reduced a bunch. So that entity might need the resource for RPS purposes, but basically wouldn't have an RA need for that resource if their load curve's already been adjusted. Am I correct in kind of understanding that entity wouldn't really have any RA demand for that project, and you wouldn't be contracting that project and on the basis of the RA value, and you would potentially, if that project isn't contracted and say it had a good system diversity value, you wouldn't have that resource coming online if that individual LSC didn't really have a need for it in their net load curve when they started contracting.
Yeah, you raise a good point on tradability on the net basis. So obviously on this kind of supply kind of gross basis, you would be able to trade it. I will admit
wouldn't the trading be relative? Wouldn't the trading be relative to whoever it's being traded to? So you couldn't really assess what that value is when you're trying to enter into the first contract, as compared to an ELCC approach where we know what the capacity value is. That capacity value will be reflected in the CAISO's master file, and that is what we would contract around.
Well, even under an exceedance, under an exceedance approach, you would have a pretty good sense of what that profile would look like, and so kind of what that hour would be. So I think you would still have kind of the same visibility on an exceedance basis as you would have on an ELCC basis. Ex ante, if that's the question.
Well, I think that's the issue for us, is trying to understand, is that exceedance value, is that, can we really figure out what that is, and can we contract around that in the context of a system where each LSC is trying to net its own curve? Thanks for the response.
Yeah, Brian, I mean, I think what you're pointing out is there are a couple of issues there. One is do we know sort of how resources are going to count on an ex-ante basis in a slice of day framework? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think we will know sort of how they should be counting on an ex-ante basis. Now, and that for the most part will be based on what the production profile is of the resource, and it will be specified and probably calculated on an hour-by-hour basis, or would be calculated on an hour-by-hour basis on an exceedance type of basis. Now, that's one aspect of it, but that's not the only thing that is a complicating factor, particularly if you're going to be doing a net load approach. The net load approach, for the most part, is basically requires the contracted or the output of the contracted resources by the LSE to be netted off of that LSE's load. And so to be able to do that netting, you need to know in advance that resource essentially has been contracted so it can be credited to be able to provide that capacity value. You're correct in that if that transaction doesn't take place before each LSE would have to report its contracted renewables in advance to the PUC essentially, so the PUC could essentially take the load curve of that LSE and net off what the production profiles are of the resources, of the renewable resources that it's been contracted for that. Now that's on an ex-ante, and that's sort of a two-cycle basis, because then that would set the net load requirement for that LSE. And any procurement after that is presumed essentially to be meeting that net load requirement. Now the open question to some degree is, okay, is it possible essentially to use renewable resources that hadn't been pre-contracted to be able to meet that need? And I guess to some degree that's an open question, and whether or not that would be something that would be allowed. It does show that there is a complication essentially with being able to try and do a net load, doing things on a net load basis, because to do the netting on an LSE by LSE basis, you need to know in advance what their contracted renewables are so you can do that netting. So it is a complication to some degree in the calculation of the net load, doing a net load type of approach. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
It is, Peter. Thank you. And it'd be great if the working group report could kind of reflect some of that complication that you were describing.
Okay.
Let's move on to Noaa and Doc Karpa.
Hey, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Peter or Luke, do you guys have a sort of a preference on these options here, whether it's gross versus net load allocations, I guess?
It sounds like, no, you're asking us to sort of, the way we're thinking about it to some degree is that there are trade-offs between the two, and how are we thinking about what some of those trade-offs are? Certainly from what I just described, going to a net load approach requires an additional showing by LSEs, and it adds to the complication of basically a showing to the LSEs of essentially what their load is and what they have contracted. And then Energy Division essentially has to do that calculation to be able to get what their RA requirement is. There's some question, as I just mentioned, as to whether or not, am I going to now then allow renewables that were uncontracted essentially to meet that requirement? I don't think that has yet been decided one way or the other, but it does seem to be adding more complications to the process of essentially establishing what the requirements are from say a gross load basis, where it would be essentially, as we've laid out, the gross load as forecast by the CEC on a system-wide basis with the adjustments to the LSEs, the sum of the LSE, to be able to then essentially get an LSE level forecast, which would then be the basis of the requirement. So to answer your question, Noah, the one is add more complication. And I guess we have some question as to whether that complication is really necessary, or what the benefit is of having a greater complication in the process.
Thanks for that. That was helpful. I'm wondering, on if we were sort of just going down this net load approach, I also see some of these complications. I'm just wondering whether or not sort of the ISO is able to sort of facilitate the validation process for net load requirements, and what does it do with regards to the shown capacity from LSE's individual renewable resources. That step is not clear to me.
Yeah, no, and you point something out, which is the ISO certainly does things on a gross load basis rather than on a net load basis in terms of the validation and the showing. And so any resources that would be going, any renewable resources that would be going into the calculation of the net load would still have the same showing requirement as any resources that were procured essentially to meet that RA requirement. And so from the ISO's perspective, there shouldn't probably be a difference, but there would have to be a requirement that whatever the resources were that were going to calculate the net load essentially had to show up on the LSE showing to the ISO as essentially as supply resources.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, this is Doug Carpenter from PC. I think it's my turn. Certainly there are complications with using a net load at an LSE level process. The part of the reason I think why we're interested in it is, of course, because LSEs procure resources to meet our particular load, our particular load profile, so that if our resources are taken off the system, overall the net load that we would be procuring for energy is different from what we're procuring for RA. And so we'd end up having to, like, if we're procuring resources to meet our energy needs in all hours, which PCE is doing, it would leave us in this weird position where we've got some little slug left over that we have to buy extra RA essentially for other people's customers, right? Because the difference between those is entirely due to what other people are doing. And that represents a cost shift, which, it's going to, particularly, it's going to, it would be beneficial for LSEs that have load profiles that match the system more closely. We are winter peaking, we're on the coast, so we have a very different load profile from the rest of the state. So there may be other ways to skin this particular problem, but that's sort of why we tend to think about the LSE level as preferable to netting everything off the system.
Yeah, no, Doug, I can appreciate that. And I guess the way I would think about that is that if you're going to do a bottom up, you do need to essentially credit to the LSE the resources they have, that LSE has contracted, and not necessarily sort of a general approach. Because you're right. I mean, if you don't align that up right, then essentially you're going to be getting some resources or some procurement being required on some LSEs for load that they don't actually isn't needed to meet their requirement. From our perspective, that's one of the reasons why I think we like the fact that if you do it from a gross basis and then essentially allocate to the LSEs on a slice by slice basis, that would reflect or be able to reflect essentially what the requirements are of that LSE in that particular slice, and could be matched to some degree to the procurement that's actually being done by that LSE.
Brian, did you have another question, or did your hand stay up?
Sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
Okay, so it seems we don't have other hands up. So if people have any additional questions, please raise your hands. But for now, it seems like That's all. Bridget Sparks.
I put the question in the chat, but I thought I'd go ahead and answer it. So Peter, you were saying earlier, under the net load approach, that wind and solar would still have to be shown to the CAISO under sort of our typical validation processes. So my question is, what would we count them as? So would we continue to use ELCC to validate their value, or what's the implication of what that resources capacity value would be that the CAISO is using?
Yeah, Bridget, I mean, you ask a good question, and I probably spoke a little too quickly from the shooting from the hip on that. I haven't thought that hard about exactly sort of how the showing processes between the PUC and the ISO would line up on that. And as I understand it to some degree, how that should take place. I believe the ISO is contemplating essentially looking at more than just the peak load, but also looking at sort of the net peak hour as well, in lining up resources and looking at that when validating RA. So let me just back off of what my answer was and say, you're right, this needs some more consideration and some more thought in how that alignment should take place. Particularly if it's done on a net load basis. I think if it's done on a gross load basis, I think there still is a need for a discussion, particularly if the ISO is going to continue to use a counting uses a different counting mechanism than the PUC uses for meeting the resources. So I would say let's tee that up for further discussion. Bridget, is that satisfactory, or?
Yeah,
or do you have additional thoughts on that?
Not at this moment, but yes, I do think we'd have to figure out some sort of translation process between how the CPUC is checking things for compliance purposes versus what's shown, and then also how that translates to a must-offer obligation, depending on how the resource counting works out.
Right.
Okay, Kathleen Colbert.
Sure. Hi, this is Kathleen. I was going to put this in the chat, but I'm kind of and since if we have time, I'll just share that Bridget brings up a really good question. And it's something that we've submitted comments to the CAISO on recently to get a better sense of how the CAISO is doing this for their net load kind of check in the local test. I raised it for the group to crowdsource. So in the CAISO's local capacity studies, they are actually doing an adjusted peak. So they are looking at the net load period, and the CAISO is making specific resource assumptions. I've asked for more clarity for them to provide some source information. I know they reference they're using CEC solar profiles for the solar, and that they're using TPP, the transmission planning process, assumptions for wind and qualifying facilities. But it would be great if Bridget could come back with Catalin and provide some more technical answer to that, because I know, knowing that process and knowing Catalin, I'm sure he has a reason for why he picked those, like why that is the assumptions the CAISO picked for how to value the solar and wind in their net load assessment. And it would be helpful to understand that context as we're exploring it here as well. Thanks.
Yeah, Kathleen, let me express also a desire to make sure that people understand essentially what's going on, particularly in the LCR process. And I would recommend, for the most part, that that there be engagement in the ISO's LCR process in terms of what the requirements are and how the requirements are set. They are undergoing that. I think comments were, I'm not sure where exactly that is in the stakeholder process at the ISO, but questions like that, which are really very much ISO centric in terms of how they're doing that analysis, is really, I think, needs to be addressed at the ISO through an ISO stakeholder process.
I completely agree. So flagging that, like and you know, that's where those questions that I've submitted have gone. What I kind of heard in the last question was, well, how should the ISO handle it for system? And I think that it is and I'm not sure how we want to sleeve that, but I do know that it, you know, we need to have it in a we need to have the conversation, and we can either have it there from the perspective of you do this in local, do you plan to use this in your system assessments, or we can do it here. I don't have a preference. I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that they already have made some decisions here.
Yeah, Kathleen, I mean, that's really just the nature of the way the system, the analyses are set up and the forwardness of the analysis that the ISO does on that. And granted, we're talking about implementation for, you know, 2024 RA here, or the 2024 RA year, and the ISO is already doing analysis on the LCR front for that period and beyond. There will have to be an explanation and discussion about sort of how the revised PUC system requirements will mesh with not only the ISO system aspects, which I think Bridget and I were just speaking about a little bit, but also about how that lines up also with the local requirements and how the local requirements are going to fit into that from a PUC perspective. And so that is also something I think is a part of what we're going to have to be discussing and have be a part of whatever the proposal is in this proceeding.
I completely agree. When I have been delving a little bit farther into and realizing that CAISO has already kind of put their, you know, drawn a bit of a line in the sand on how they think these types of assessments should be done, it has raised some concerns on my part that if we go down the path and kind of pick exceedance, or exceedance is closer to what I think they're doing than ELCC, right. Okay, yeah, I'm on the same page. That if we deviate, you know, if what we pick here is too far away from what the CAISO has already kind of mapped out as the way they want to look at it, I just am concerned about discrepancies of this design flowing down into CPM impacts. And just to highlight why I think it is related, when we ask questions about the system impacts, we need to be, you know, this is important to make sure that there is alignment on between what we're doing here and what the CAISO is going to assess for system sufficiencies.
Yeah, it's certainly something that is under consideration. From a presentation perspective, I think we've come to the end of what PG&E has prepared for presentation. I will note there was some conversation in the chat about discussions on having more discussions or more in-depth discussions about storage and how storage fits in. And I guess from my perspective, certainly the way these workshops have laid out and have been laid out to date, they were sort of, each one of the topics of the workshops was discussed early in the process, and a schedule was set up based on what each of those topics were. You know, with the first two workshops being on the structure, the second two being on resource counting, the third and fourth being on resource counting, the fifth and sixth essentially being on need determination allocation. You know, the seventh one essentially being a wrap up on the slice of day or summary of the slice of day before moving to sort of other issues. And I'm hearing a desire to some degree to spend some more time on discussing storage and storage in particular with regard to some of this slice a day framework. And the only reason I bring that up is that I think it's probably fine for us to change the schedules, if not whatnot, but I think we need to have a discussion about that and whether or not we want to move forward with it. So, Barbara, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to comment on this?
I would. Being somebody who's getting writer's cramp, taking notes on these and following them very closely, I'm really concerned about the schedule. We owe a report in February, and if we have some additional workshops and we're not going to give up the ones we have, then the schedule is going to have to be extended. And it's also, remember that we're still trying to the extent we can to drive towards some sort of consensus. And I think, you know, there are a couple of variations on the proposal, so we certainly don't have consensus yet. I don't know that we have time to have 2 workshops on storage in terms of just getting this finished. Now, we're going to have an all hands on deck of the people who are organizing this on Friday, I know, to talk about that. Right. But if people want to have workshops on storage, then I think, or meetings on storage, I think they need to think about whether there's some topics that be consolidated, you know, with some of the remaining ones so that we can actually get the report in on time. As you know, we're having timing issues with respect to the demand response working group. And I really don't want this one to run out of time and have to go back to the commission and ask for more time, because we all know that the RA program is not working well and we need to have something in place by 2024 to fix it. So if anybody has some suggestions as to how we could structure the remaining working group meetings to not run out of time, but address these additional topics, I would hope they would make a suggestion to the sort of coordinating panel before we meet on Friday, so we can take their suggestions into account. I think that would be a most efficient use of time.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. I tend to agree that there is, for people who are not involved, there is basically the facilitators and the people who are facilitating the workshops do have a process meeting scheduled for Friday, where we'll talk about sort of, you know, what we've done to date, sort of where we are in putting together chapters for the final report, as well as sort of next steps. And in that certainly is the opportunity to have a discussion as to whether we want to modify the workshop schedule from what we have in terms of adding or taking things away. Let me just note that you know, this is the 5th workshop. We have, I believe we have 4 more to go that are already scheduled, and that is taking us well into the middle of January, and with the pace that we're currently going. And so I think Barbara makes a very good point, is that if we're going to add more workshops, we're going to have to ask for some extension of time if that is seen to be an important enough thing to do. Alternatively, we're going to need to either double up subjects or have you know, longer workshops on particular topics. You know, this workshop, I think for the most part, we've tried to give an overview of some of sort of how PG&E sees everything fitting together, and I think that's been a good discussion about that. I also think that it was a really very much an introduction to sort of the way we're talking and thinking about sort of need determination and allocation. So with that, I would endorse essentially Barbara's suggestion that you know, please reach out to the coordinating team if you think that you know, the topics need to be adjusted in some form. Yeah, it looks like Bridget has made the suggestion in the chat that we might be able to put these into the January workshops. That is a distinct possibility in terms of some of the discussion, and that could be one of the options that is made and suggested. So I think there'll be further discussion with that with the facilitator group team when we meet on Friday. Kathleen's asking to confirm the coordinating team. That's the team that basically was, if you look at the emails that have been sent out essentially on setting these things up and the schedule, the facilitators for the most part, it's all of the set of the facilitators in PG&E that have been on the facilitating and coordinating team.
Hey, Peter, before you move on, can I just ask Claire, because I've been getting confused about this. So it's PG&E plus all of the workshop facilitators.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Peter, it looks like Sue Mara has her hand up.
Yeah, Sue, go ahead.
Hi, Peter. Thank you. So I noticed we have the one workshop on December 15th. That's sort of the recap. Has there been or maybe in your meeting on Friday, you can discuss how is it we're going to be coming to consensus? There's, sort of like 3 main proposals on the table. They all have moving parts. We have to decide on a lot of those moving parts. And there are certain camps we know about. So how do we come to consensus? Do we think we're going to be submitting more than one proposal to the commission, then the commission gets to choose? Has there been any discussion of that?
I would say there has not been any, Sue, there hasn't been any sort of discussion about sort of exactly what will it look like and how will it come together. I guess from PG&E's perspective, we are planning to put together a proposal, or at least one proposal that tries to fit all the pieces together and tries to specify sort of all of the things that we've talked about in terms of what the structure is, what the counting rules are, what the steps would be to come to an agreement in terms of, the planning reserve margin and those sorts of things. And to the extent that other parties have proposals, it's sort of my expectation that in that workshop in December, which is the second workshop in December, essentially would be the place where all of that would be presented and aired. Now, it's probably not clear that we're going to be able to get to a consensus, or we may not get to a consensus in that discussion, in that workshop. But at least the thinking from on my part, and I think on PG&E's part, is that there would be much more well-specified proposals brought forward and aired at that time. Now, if we come to the conclusion that that the workshop report needs to have multiple different proposals, and that's what's in the workshop report, then I think that may be one option if we can't coalesce around a single proposal.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how we coalesce. I mean, obviously, everyone will never agree to everything. So I'm just wondering how we get to the point where we can say the majority or, some large percentage have coalesced around this package.
I think to some degree that is incumbent upon parties in their comments and their informal comments to say what they like and what they don't like. Also remember that this workshop report is going to the PUC, and there are likely to be comments and reply comments on it at the PUC. So whatever gets specified in the workshop report, if it is multiple proposals or if it's a single proposal, certainly modifications or changes to any of the proposals would be probably fair game in comments and reply comments to the PUC on the workshop report.
Okay.
So Sue, does that answer your question, or does that give you more insight?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm thrilled about it, but it's really, I just have to, and I'm sure you all feel the same that I do, that this virtual thing has benefits and costs, and one of the costs is we don't sit in a room and hammer things out. You can't do it using this format. You just can't do it. So I would be, if I had some brilliant idea of how to move forward and get coalescence around a particular package, I would certainly offer it, but obviously I don't.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Scott.
Yeah, hi, Peter. This is Scott with IEP. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So one thing, I'm still somewhat of a novice Teams user. I'm getting there, but I just did a little bit of research, and apparently the meeting organizer can create polls in meetings, something I've never done. but that's something we might think about doing for the recap meeting. And it might also be helpful, and we can talk about this Friday, the organizers, is whether to create 2 or 3 different kind of straw proposals that wrap everything up into kind of more coherent packages, and then ask people to vote on those, and then that'll help focus conversation on the differences and the merits of one or the other, and potentially how to draw elements from one, until you get to some synthesis that works for most people. But we can talk about that on Friday.
Okay, thanks for that suggestion, Scott. It looks like next up is a 202 caller. I'm not sure who that is. Area code 202 246 3025.
Oh.
Okay, it looks like that hand's been lowered. So, Greg Klatt.
Now?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Peter. This is Julia Prochnik. Sorry,
Hi, Julia.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out the phone with no visual. Got it. Thanks. I also just wanted to say I appreciate Barbara's point about making sure we do this in the right time. But I also wanted to offer up, since I am helping facilitate the January 5th, and there's only been one group that's thinking about presenting, we might be able to use that time slot to kind of look at both hedging and some of the stores discussions.
Yeah, Julia, that's a good point. The workshops in after the end of the year are perhaps a little less full in terms of issues, but we that certainly is an option we should discuss on Friday.
Great, thank you all.
Yeah, Greg, go ahead.
Thanks, Peter. Greg Klatt for Western Power Trading Forum. In terms of where we are in the workshop process and the prospects of being able to coalesce around 1 or perhaps 2 proposals, I've had that concern since day one in terms of the amount of time that the commission gave us, and also in terms of the scheduling of the workshops. So I feel a little bit like Cassandra, right? So I keep on making prophecies about we're not going to get there, and nobody believes me. But I think we're getting to the point that everyone kind of sees the writing on the wall. A thought I had is that after this next workshop on need and allocation, we have the recap workshop. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I think what we may want to shoot for is for folks, and I apologize if someone mentioned this before because I was kind of multitasking, but I think if we could dedicate that workshop not to a recap, I think we spent a lot of time kind of going over the nuts and bolts and how they interact with each other. If we could have proposals, comprehensive proposals made at that workshop, and then afterwards, kind of do some intensive coordination and straw polling and things like that to see where we're at. I think at that point, we'll have a good idea of 1, how many proposals we're looking at, and what are the prospects of coming to any sort of resolution or consensus on any of the elements in time to present that to the commission in February. If it looks like we won't be able to do that, my sense is that the commission would prefer that we spend another month or 2, if that's necessary, to try to reach a consensus, as opposed to just presenting them with a report that has several proposals. They do not have the benefit of having sat through the workshops, the ALJ and the assigned commissioner. It's going to be a very difficult task for them to try to pick and choose. It was already somewhat surprising they did so in the first place with the decision that came out in June. That was good, but if we go back to them with several proposals, we really haven't moved the ball forward from their perspective, is my sense. So I long-winded way of saying, I think the lesser sin would be to ask for more time than to present them with something that is not really responsive to how I interpreted the decision.
Okay, Greg, thanks for that. So it sounds like you would propose essentially that the working group should, instead of putting together the report, if we don't come to consensus and we think we can get to consensus, that we ask for more time.
That would be my predilection.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. That certainly is something we can discuss, and certainly could be on the table for further discussion as the process moves forward. Noah.
Hey, Peter, this is Noah from Middle River Power. Yeah, actually, Greg took a lot of the words out of my mouth, so I will support everything he said. I was a little bit concerned on when Scott mentioned that, coming up with 3 or 4 proposals for, I think maybe it was a December 15th workshop as well, and getting polls from what people are supportive of. My concern was that, hopefully as we all try to coalesce around one or whatever proposal, that we have the ability to iterate on that, right? And so I would hope that as you guys are continuing to discuss sort of the schedule, that you allot time for that, as opposed to here is the proposal, take it or leave it, and then we go to the commission with, here are several proposals, here's what people didn't like, here's what people liked. Pick the one that you think you like the best. I don't get the way that we should move forward. I think we should try to get to as few number of proposals going into the commission as possible, so that we all work towards the same goal. And if that requires going to the commission now and asking for a longer runway, so that allows us to get there, so be it. I would support that. I don't have a problem with that at all. Instead of waiting until February and asking, a week or 2 before the workshop is due, or workshop report is due, to get there.
Okay, no, thanks for that perspective. I'm sure that will be part of the discussion on Friday when the facilitators talk. But I appreciate that perspective. Kathleen?
Yeah, thanks. Kathleen from Vistra. I echo everything Greg and Noah just said, and Barbara and Sue. I feel like it's feeling like a bit of we're finding a consensus that we need more time, and that is at least a positive outcome. Not to make a bad joke, sorry. But I would just add to the conversation that I heard someone say, well, how do we go about doing it? There's lots of different ways to do kind of work on this in a virtual format, which is much more difficult. And I completely agree that this is more difficult in this virtual format. And I think that's another consensus item we can all agree to today. But I do have experience with some other formats, and I think that there are some best practices. And so I would ask the facilitator group, when you all come together on Friday, to think about this. So like what I would consider next steps in a virtual format, something like this would include you can either call it a design matrix or an options matrix. It normally has a left-hand column that includes all of the elements. So like you've done a great job of going through those in your presentations, but so think about putting those down there as design elements. And then each column you would start with your status quo, which I've also seen lots of people do. So we're doing a great job of that too. And then the columns to the right of that would be the different proposals. What each proposal has, it's in a single document. It's made more concise so that people can look across the elements at the various options. Because where often when I have done processes that have utilized this tool, sometimes that makes it clear to parties, well, none of these packages are working for us individually, but perhaps this option, like we can make a new proposal out of these options. That's something that everyone can coalesce around, and it's easier to see it when it's in this matrix suggested format. I've also seen leveraged, okay, once you have those options, the polls being used effectively as non-binding polls. and you ask, well, do you have a preference of these options? And that can, and you can ask for other suggestions. I think of it as less of a poll on which proposal do you prefer. I don't think we're ready for that, and heard Noah say that. But it is getting a sense across this community as to which of the options we've discussed for each of these elements are gaining traction. That would be very valuable. So a design matrix plus some indicative non-binding poll results across the options for each of those elements would sure help me better process all these discussions so that we could go into that iterative discussion Noah proposed. And I'm happy to share my experience if facilitators would like to have some examples of these.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen, for that suggestion. We certainly we'll keep that we'll bring that up at the facilitator group discussion on Friday, and consider that option. Julia. Hey, Julia, your hand is still up. Do you have anything more? I guess not. Okay. Let me turn it back to Sergio and Alan for wrap up.
Sorry about that. I was speaking and I was muted. Oh, well, Alan, if you want to go for it, go ahead.
No, I think this has been a good discussion. I don't think there's a whole lot extra to say. You have anything more?
No, just to thank everyone for their active participation and PG&E for filling all these questions. We'll also have a conversation on schedule and how to best take advantage of our recap session later on this Friday among the organizing team. So thank you for the ideas, and we'll look forward to chatting more in our next workshop.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.